And here we are. Well, welcome everybody to our live stream on Cuba. What is the crisis that's happening there right now, and the result of a now blockade on the island and the horrifying sanctions that the people there have to live with. I'm joined by three guests with me here. We have Jovanni Reyes, who is a longtime participant in the crazy stuff we do on Fortress on a Hill. Very glad to have him here. We have let me get the names of the people. And Monisha Rios and Rachell Tucker, and all four of us actually are members of About Face. And so we're here to talk about Cuba. And how are you guys doing?
Doing well. Happy to be here. How are you?
I'm doing all right. Doing well.
Doing well.
So I'm actually not a member of AF, but I'm happy to be thought of as one. I'm not.
Honorary. I have that authority.
Thank you. I'll take it.
So I'll just kind of go around the horn and read your guys' bios, and anything else that you'd like to add at the end, please do. We'll start with the J-Man. Jovanni Reyes is a member organizer in About Face Veterans Against the War. He is a 14-year veteran of the U.S. Army, took part in NATO's first Forever War, where he witnessed firsthand the profit-making motives of war and the calamities it causes to those who are on the receiving end. Jovanni resigned from the military after being deeply convicted with the invasion and occupation of Iraq in 2007. He holds a master's degree in international relations and a second in instructional technology. His activism consists of educating the public on the military-industrial complex and hybrid wars. Jovanni, thanks for being here, man.
Thank you for having me again, Henry. Happy to be here.
Monisha Rios is a Puerto Rican psychologist and anti-imperialist veteran working to expose the psychological warfare component of U.S.-led hybrid warfare. Since 2015, she has been investigating the American Psychological Association's 104-year role in the weaponization and militarization of psychology in service to imperialism, from psychological operations to human engineering and the design of weapon systems, with a special focus on war narratives used to target and destabilize people's liberation movements in Latin America and the Caribbean. Monisha, glad you're here to join us.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here too.
And last but certainly not least is Rachell Tucker, who is a Cuban-American elementary school teacher. She is an anti-imperialist veteran of the U.S. Imperialist Army and a member of the Party for Socialism and Liberation, and also a member of About Face Veterans Against the War. Rachel, welcome.
Thank you.
So, I was hoping we would start. I'd like to go through some history, but I'd like to get your guys' initial impressions of what's been happening in Cuba, say, number one, in the last 6 weeks to 2 months, and second, how Cuba has weathered COVID. And whoever wants to jump in.
I mean, I can start, and then we can all join. So in the last couple months, what we've seen is the same thing that has been happening for the last 60 years since Cuba won their revolution, right? Their socialist revolution. And it's been an attack, an imperialist attack against sovereignty and self-determination of people. And it has been ramped up hybrid war, right? And using the cultural music arts section of the country, right? And we have a lot of paid, like U.S. paid, like through NED and CIA backed musicians on the island, artists on the island that have been basically creating a little bit of not a little bit, but creating counter-revolutionary, counter U.S. What is it called, propaganda on the island. And this happened, the first time it happened really was on November 27th with the San Isidro movement, right? And so the U.S., especially the Cuban American mafia, like they are called in Miami, has really been pushing and pushing and pushing against for the U.S. to do something, right? And they've had demonstrations called from in Miami that happened simultaneously with demonstrations happening on the island, counter-revolutionary demonstrations, right? And so there's a lot of foreign intervention, heavy use of social media to promote these kinds of actions. Like I've been following pretty closely, like Cuba Debate, and I really love the way that they've been reporting these attacks for all these several months, right? They are very clear. They tell the people, they follow social media, and they post different pages, and they explain, like, this person came out to us and told us that they received a random call asking them to put a bomb at Las Tunas, a school, right? And people come out on Cuban media explaining how they're getting random calls, right, from connections in the U.S. Anyways, it's from this San Isidro thing, it has been built and built and built, where now they have a group called 27N, which is a spin-off of the San Isidro movement. They organize through WhatsApp, and Cuban media puts these messages on there to show their people how counter-revolutionaries are basically organizing, right? And how how they use social media to promote just destabilization. And additionally, we've seen from like the Biden administration and Blinken an attack on the Cuban doctors, right? Saying that they're being trafficked, humanly trafficked, that essentially they're slave workers, and there's been so much more. But I mean, Cuba has handled COVID better than most countries in the U.S. with the blockade that it's had for over 60 years. It's created 5 vaccines, 2 that that have passed the trials, and they just don't have the resources they need, like such as needles, to have that mass campaign that is necessary. Currently, they're having an outbreak because there has been some tourism in areas like Matanzas, which is like one of the areas that was hit harder with this counter-revolutionary action on July 11th. But yeah, I'll stop there. If y'all want to add anything, please.
Yeah, let me jump in just to bump Rachel, what she said there. I mean, any analysis, any conversation that any conversation around Cuba always has to start with this this aggression, this war that has been declared on Cuba since it won its revolution in 1959. The following year, that's when the sanction regime started, and they haven't ceased since. So any critique, any conversation, anything that's surrounded with Cuba, right, is always have to start from the blockade and the war of aggression against Cuba, and that's something that mainstream media always admit. You know, they will critique this policy or that policy, but they never mention the war of aggression. They never mention by other means, you know, it's hybrid war. They never mention the sanction regime, you know, and how much pain is causing to the population, which is by design, you know. Yeah, I'll pass it on to Monisha right now.
Thanks. Well, yeah, I think too, when we look at the significance of Cuba in the region, right? So look at how the U.S. has been imposing itself in Latin America and the Caribbean just in the recent years, and the escalation of imperialist aggression in Bolivia, Venezuela, Brazil, Peru, etc., and going down the line, and now Haiti. And I think it's a regional thing as well, especially when Evo to come back to Bolivia. Lula is back in the picture, and Castillo just won in Peru. So you've got also this resurgence of socialism, of people's movements taking political power in the region as well, and that's a threat to the United States. So this recent escalation in Cuba feels to me it's about Cuba, and it's also about the region. Oh, and about COVID. I mean, just like what Jovanni was saying, anybody who's going to look at how Cuba has done during the pandemic needs to look at it through the context of how they've really been up against some impossible circumstances under the blockade, with the increasing sanctions, with the brutality of it, and to have the low infection rates that they've had in comparison to the rest of the world, and the high survival rates that they've had in comparison to the rest of the world, to me is miraculous, and it speaks volumes to what they're capable of under even the worst conditions. And I myself benefited from one of the Cuban doctors who was in Venezuela when I was there as an election observer. When I got COVID, I was able to receive treatment that I think saved my life. It was the ozone therapy treatment. And that's the other thing about medicine in Cuba, is because their priorities are human needs, they're able to have advances in medicine that the rest of the so-called developed world does not enjoy, because their priorities are in the wrong direction.
There was a trying to remember, Juan Gonzalez mentioned this about it on Democracy Now!, saying that Cuba has a population close or maybe a little bit more than New York City. But if you were to compare how many people have died in New York City compared to how many people have died in Cuba, that it really explains a lot. And it's not that American cruelty is new to me at all, but it seems spectacularly cruel that a nation that is making its own vaccines can't even get needles to give people those vaccines. You know, but it also tells you a lot about what globalization has done, and about the pinch that American sanctions have done on Cuba. It's just fucking grotesque. I don't I don't have a better way to say it than that. Before we go any further, I'd like to talk a little bit about the history of the blockade, how it began, a bit on kind of the breadth of it, but specifically say in the last 15 to 20 years, so people can get a good idea of what that really looks like from the Cuban side.
I can go. So the history of the blockade. So to understand the blockade, or what the UN call economic coercive measures, you got to understand the relationship that Cuba has had with the United States. I mean, Cuba for the Spaniards was an important, just like Puerto Rico, was an important a first defense or frontline defense to their empire in Mexico and in South America, right? That's why you have Guantanamo Bay. Guantanamo Bay used to be a Spanish naval base, you know. That's why so that was the frontline defense of their empire in South America and in Mexico, which was their cash cow. When the British invaded and occupied Cuba, the Spaniards traded Cuba for Florida. At the time, Florida was also a Spanish colony, but they preferred to have Cuba over Florida territory, so they gave Florida to the British in exchange for Cuba. So that right there, it tells you the strategic importance that Cuba plays in geopolitics, geostrategic politics, and whatnot. When the United States had this revolution in the American Revolution, right? Afterwards, its third president, Jefferson already had an eye on Cuba. Jefferson wanted to buy Cuba from Spain. And Spain refused to sell Cuba, but Jefferson, they already had an eye for Cuba, right? Jefferson said something, I'm paraphrasing, that, over time, Cuba was going to belong to the United States, over time. And that was important. It's only Cuba is only like 90 miles away from Florida. So it's very close, right? So fast forward to the revolutions, the wars of independence in Cuba in the late 1880s. There were Cuban independence movement fighting against a protracted guerrilla war against the Spaniards, that were going on for a long period of time. And so were the Filipinos at the same time as well. So Spain was degraded and spent. They were about to lose, and then in came the United States on the side of the revolutionaries, on the side of the independence fighters, right, doing the Spanish-American War, right? So that happened in 1898. So Spain fell, lost. It's only two colonies left in the Western Hemisphere, which was Cuba and Puerto Rico. Cuba and Puerto Rico both fell under the U.S. control. So did Guam, and so did the Philippines and Mariana Islands, and Hawaii also. Hawaii wasn't part of Spain, but also Hawaii was an independent nation at the time, but also fell at the same time in 1898, right? All these territories came into the American Empire. Puerto Rico became a direct colony of the United States. However, because in Cuba there was already an active resistance against the Spaniards, right? And because what happened in the Philippines, that also had an active resistance against the Spaniards when the Americans took over the Philippines and resisted also the Americans, and they had this long war against the American, right? The Americans didn't want to repeat the same thing in Cuba, right? So Cuba was given quote unquote independence, right? Whereas Puerto Rico and the Philippines were not. They became direct colonies, right? They became independence, but they became kind of like they were given political representation, they were given political independence, but they continue to have economic dependency of the United States, right? The United States continue to owned a lot of land in Cuba, right? The sugar company, owned a lot of land in Cuba and everything. So Cuba became a de facto colony of the United States, whereas, they had their own government, they had whatnot, this and that, right? But they were still they were kind of a neo-colony of the United States, right? Fast forward to 1959, you have the Cuban Revolution, where the 26th of July movement, that was the movement led by Fidel Castro, right, overthrew the Batista government, which Batista also came into power via a quote unquote revolution, right? But the one of the 26th July movement, right, that became an authentic revolution, whereas revolutions in the past in Cuba were pretty much they overthrew whatever president was in power at the time, but they kept the same relationship with the United States. Does that make sense? So this person will have a revolution in Cuba and will overthrow this government, but they kept the same relationship with the United States. The United States didn't really care who was in power, right? Never really cared who was in power, right? As long as the economic relationship and the military geopolitical, strategic, thing were kept intact, right? But with the 26th of July movement was different, because the 26th of July movement wasn't just a movement to overthrow Batista. It was also a movement to free itself from foreign power, which was i.e. the United States, right? So that's what they did. So when Cuba, one of the first actions of the Cuban Revolution was to nationalize key sectors of the economy in Cuba. Cuba was very, very poor, right? Literacy rate at the time was around in the was like 70% or something like that, right? It was malnutrition, right? Most of the capital, most of the wealth was held in Havana, right? There was if you remember if you remember the movie The Godfather 2, when they were cutting that big cake, the size, it was a cake of the map of Cuba. There were these gangsters were cutting and slicing Cuba up. That was metaphoric of what was happening, right? You had all these gangsters, you had all these business people pretty much slicing up Cuba for themselves, and just a minority, a what is called a comprador class, of Cubans, benefit from it. Just a minority of the benefit from this relationship, where the majority didn't. There was malnutrition, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So when the 26th of July movement triumphed in 1959, December, right, and Batista left towards the Dominican Republic, then eventually went to Europe and whatnot, with cash, with all that, with luggages full of money out of the country, right? So one of the first acts that the 26th of July movement did was to nationalize key sectors of the economy, right? And that right there was a red line for American capitalists and who then lobbied the Eisenhower administration, who then Eisenhower put the first sanctions on Cuba in 1960, right? Was Eisenhower that was starting to organize the counter-revolutionaries, right? For the invasion of the Bay of Pigs, or Playa Girón, how they call it in Cuba. But it was actually Kennedy who pulled the trigger, and Kennedy was the one that gave the green light to the invasion. The invasion in 1961 was a fiasco, right? It lasted about 3 days, and then they were all caught. I mean, there were like thousands. There were like 10,000 Cuban exiles, made up of Cuban exiles, and some people from other parts of Latin America, right, also joined in. And they were caught. Most of them were caught. If they didn't die in the attempt and whatnot, this and that, right? And then after that, that's when the government of Cuba, under the leadership of Castro, right, sought the protection or sought the support of the Soviet Union. And because of that, that's when Kennedy enacted the first blockade, or the first embargo, right, which actually literally put ships around Cuba, right, to avoid entering and whatnot, right. That's when the whole Cuban Missile Crisis started and everything like that, right. Fast forward to Ronald Reagan. pretty much in 1979 there was a global oil crisis when with the Iranian Revolution sparked an oil crisis around the world. You know, the Iranian Revolution pretty much ousted the Shah. The Shah was pretty much a puppet for the British oil company and American oil company and all that, right? So when the Iranians nationalized the petroleum in Iran, you know, it sparked a crisis, a global crisis, right? Which was felt all around the world. Oil prices went up and everything like that. It also hurt Cuba as well. Cuba was under sanctions. And on top of that, right, oil prices went high, right? So Reagan took the opportunity there to increase the sanctions on Cuba, right? So increase the sanctions on Cuba. Cuba at the time was supporting revolutionary movements around the world, including in South Africa. Angola and etc. So Reagan put Cuba under the country, the state sponsor of terror. So the state sponsor of terror list pretty much made Cuba the pariah, right? Which pretty much scared any person who risked doing business with Cuba, right? Pretty much cut any lifeline on, right? Only the Soviet Union and the socialist bloc continued to have this economic relationship with Cuba, right? But that sparked riots. The sanctions that Reagan increased with the oil crisis sparked riots. That's what also sparked what they call the Mariel boat lift. You know, where about 100,000 Cubans went unwrapped and came to Florida. That's where the movie Scarface was started. If you remember the movie Scarface, that's how it starts with the Mariel boat lift and everything like that, right? So that's the Reagan era, right? So fast forward to Bush Jr. Well, Bush Jr. Did something that terrible, but it ultimately kind of benefited Latin America, right? Or not. Let me go back. Clinton. So this is what happened with Clinton, right? So Clinton, right, eased some of the travel restrictions placed on Cuban Americans, because before, right, Cuban Americans couldn't travel to Cuba. So once someone left or defected or left Cuba to the United States, they couldn't go back to Cuba, right? There were travel restrictions on Cuba. I mean, it split families, blah blah blah, this and that, and at the same time, the Miami Cubans, you know, the culture of Miami became very Cubanized at the same time, right? But became very Cubanized and became very embittered with the government of Havana, right? So you have these two Cuban populations, you know, pretty much emerging at the same time. One being under the boot of sanctions, and the other one pretty much became a privileged type of migrant, right? Because there were no illegal Cubans. Any Cuban that came to any Cuban that left were picked up by the Coast Guard or whatever, and were brought automatically to the United States and given asylum status, right? You can get residence and citizenship, etc., right? So there were a privileged class of migrants, whereas other migrants from Mexico, whatever, they were caught by immigration, they get sent back to the country. But Cubans didn't have that. Cubans, right, were picked up and they were taken to Florida. They were given all this status. They were given all this help to start a new life in Florida and everything like that. And this, by all means, this was to undermine the government in Havana. All this is not because it came out of the you know the bottom, you know, of the heart of the migration policies, right? So that was under Reagan. Also, Reagan started these media campaign against Cuba. They started these media platforms like Radio Martí, Radio Chiriquí, and all these state sponsored programming, you know, TV, radio, and stuff like that to beam into Cuba at the same time, right? Then fast forward to Clinton eased the travel restrictions, right? Now Cuban Americans were able to travel to Cuba, visit families, send remittances, you know, take stuff over there, right? So ease a little bit of the tension. But at the same time, the Clinton era was when the Soviet Union collapsed, you know. So Cuba lost that market with the socialist bloc. So Clinton also increased sanctions in Cuba, right, with the hope of Cuba falling apart, because at the time there were color revolutions in Eastern Europe, Romania, Poland, the Czech Republic, and all these, right? All these there was all these counter revolutions in Eastern Europe. All these communists, all these socialist government were falling. So the expectations was that Cuba will also fall as well. So restrictions was lifted on Cuban Americans. Cuban Americans can travel. Cuban Americans can bring goods with them. Shoes, T-shirts, jewelry, all kinds of stuff, all kinds of American goods to Cuba. They were able to send money. There were like two currencies circulating in Cuba at the time. There were the Cuban peso and there was US dollar circulating at the same time. People that had family in the United States had a little bit more privilege because they had access to dollars, whereas people in Cuba that didn't have family in the United States became an underclass, or underprivileged because they didn't have access to dollars, so that it started to create this class difference dynamics in Cuba at the same time in 90. And keep in mind, this is all to undermine the revolution in Cuba. These all to create internal strife, inside Cuba. Special period, that's called special period. Then came the Helms-Burton Act, which was the Cuban Liberty Democrat Solidarity Act, right? Which was an act of Congress, right? Which Congress voted to make the sanctions permanent, because at the time the sanctions was an executive action. At the time, the sanctions were by decree by the United States president. So the president enacted it, so the president could take it away, because it was an executive action. Well, when it went to Congress and when Congress voted for it with the Helms-Burton Act, right, it became law. So it became law. So the sanctions in Cuba became permanent. Only Congress can lift the sanctions, right? It became law. So it became the policy of the United States to overthrow the Cuban government. That was the law. That's the law. That's the current law right now. So the current law right now in the United States is the United States has the policy or has the right to overthrow the legal means or the legal actions to overthrow the Cuban government, right? This is similar to the Iraqi Freedom Law, right? The Iraqi Freedom Law, the Iraqi Freedom Act was in 1996, and it was kind of similar to the Cuban Helms-Burton Act which was in 1994. Was also that it was the law, it was the foreign policy of the United States to overthrow the government of Saddam Hussein, So that was the Iraqi Freedom Act. Then came the Iraq invasion. Then came where the actual United States government actually followed through with that law, with the Iraqi Freedom Act, and actually overthrew the government of Saddam Hussein, right? In 2003. But that had unintended consequences. The unintended consequences with the invasion of Iraq is that it bogged down U.S. troops in Iraq, right? It bogged down U.S. troops in Iraq, and then U.S. policy, U.S. focus was dead on the Middle East the whole time. And when that happened, right, they lost focus on what's happening in Latin America, right? Now, in Latin America, right, if you have free and fair elections, if everybody were to vote unrestricted, gerrymandering, stuff like that, 9 times out of 10, right, people are going to vote left. People are going to vote socialism in power. And that's what happened during that time, right? So one country after the other was started electing socialist governments, right? Venezuela, Ecuador, Argentina, Bolivia, right? So all these countries, right? All these countries with socialist government, right? They created a kind of a bloc, right? Which is it was given the name Pink Tide. What was happening, right? Pink Tide. So all these governments, right? They up to that point, Cuba was isolated. Cuba was isolated in the Western Hemisphere. No country did business with Cuba. No country did business with Cuba, but Canada. Canada was the only country that was allowed to have business with Cuba during this whole time, right? But when this Pink Tide came through, first with the Venezuelan government under Hugo Chavez, right? He broke the blockade by first visiting Cuba and then started to open markets between Cuba and Venezuela. After Venezuela did that, and he survived, and Hugo Chavez survived the coup in 1992, he came back with a vengeance with it, right? Then other countries started following through. Then every country in Latin America pretty much started having a relationship with Cuba. So that pretty much opened up, and that pretty much took Cuba out of the special period. Canada was doing business. Europe started doing business. Everybody started doing with business with Cuba, but the United States, right? Then in came Obama. Obama did what is called the started opening up, started starting relationship with Cuba, sent an ambassador to Cuba. Had the first time in like decades there was an ambassador. There was a Cuban ambassador, and there was an American ambassador in Havana. Opened up Cuba for tourism. American was able to go to tour, to go to tour in Cuba and everything like that. So during the 2000s, during the Obama time, 2000s, that's when Cuba pretty much left the special period and started flourishing economically. There were a lot of contradictions there because Cuba has a very highly educated population, right? Has a lot of engineers, has a lot of technicians, has a lot of doctors, has a lot of this and that, right? And now because the tourist industry brought more money into it, right? So a lot of these people that were in profession, high educated professions, right, were going into the tourist industry. I remember when I was in Cuba, we had a taxi driver that was a scientist, right? He was a scientist, and his day job was being a scientist. And at nighttime, he taxied, right? He was telling us about the new vaccine that Cuba was coming up with it was a lung vaccine. It was a lung vaccine to end cancer, lung cancer. He was telling us about it before it was actually made public that Cuba came up with that, right? So when they announced it publicly, I already knew that was coming. But at the time, I didn't take him seriously. But then, holy stuff, it happened. The guy was telling me the truth, right? So Obama, lifted some of the travel restrictions, opened up remittances to families there, but Obama wasn't doing it from purely from the bottom of his heart, for the good of his heart, right? He was trying a different approach, because up to that point the approach was front end aggression towards Cuba, right? I forgot to mention that during the Reagan era there was a lot of terrorism against Cuba. During the Carter era there was a lot of terrorism against Cuba. I mean, in the 1976, I believe it was, right? Miami Cubans downed a Cuban liner, flight 455, killing all 73 passengers, right? There were bombings. There were bow attacks against Cuban crops, to kill their food source, which is reminiscent to what happened to the buffaloes and the Native Americans, when they try to eliminate the food source of Native Americans in the plains. You kill the buffalo so they starve. So that was happening in the 70s and 80s against Cuba. There was a lot of terrorism against Cuba. But with Obama, right, the approach was different, right? The approach was, now let's try another approach, which culture exchange. So the idea was, if enough Cubans see how their relatives in Miami live, and see how and love, and meet Americans, firsthand Americans, and have this relationship and blah blah this and that, they will pretty much demand more from the government and go against the government, and then Cuba will stop being socialist and will join the capitalist world, right? That was pretty much the idea behind Obama, right? Obama took Cuba out of the terror list that Reagan put Cuba on. Reagan put Cuba on the terrorist list. Obama took Cuba out of the terror list, but at the same time, it added Ashanti Shakur, which is a Black liberation movement a person, from the 1970s, right? Activist, put her on the terror list. They came Trump. Trump came in. Trump pretty much rolled back all the Obama initiatives, right? Trump had a huge mandate in Florida. They had a lot of support in Florida. Rolled back all the Obama initiatives, right? Ended the travels to Cuba. Ended the restricted the remittances to Cuba, right? Now Cubans were limited to how much money they can send to their families. Applied maximum pressure on Cuba. Added 243 sanctions on top of the sanctions that were already on Cuba. And at the time of Trump, because Obama started the process of rolling back the left-wing governments in Latin America, by the time Trump was in power, most of Latin America became right-wing, with the exception of Nicaragua, Nicaragua, Bolivia, and Venezuela. The Bolivian government was overthrown during the Trump time, and it was replaced by a right-wing government as well. And that right-wing government, the first thing it did was to cut ties with Cuba. So all these right-wing governments, all these centrist governments, pretty much cut ties with Cuba. Cuba right now is back into a special period right now, like in 1990s, right? Biden comes in. Biden said he was going to look into the Trump policies against Cuba, but to this point, he hasn't rolled back the 243 sanctions against Cuba. Today, he added more sanctions to Cuba. He added more sanctions on Cuba. So that's, I know it's a long explanation, but that was like pretty much a timeline of the sanction regime or the blockade against Cuba. Sorry it took me so long.
Oh, no worries, man. You got to get everything in there. Mainstream media has been treating the moves that Obama made and Trump's resurgence of sanctions as kind of an angel devil kind of story, like that Obama had really done a whole bunch to improve the lives of Cubans in some meaningful way, and then this mean man Donald Trump comes along and has done all these other sanctions, which I'm sure are horrible, but it's basically what was happening the entire time, right?
Yeah, Obama said he was going to look at the sanctions, but keep in mind that the Helms and Burton Act, right? Only Congress can lift those sanctions, not the president, because it was voted into law, into American law, to maintain these permanent sanctions on Cuba, and it's American law that the United States policy is to overthrow the government of Cuba. So the president cannot roll back those sanctions, but Biden can, but Obama could lift some of the restrictions on travel. That's what he did. That's why you have the flow of the money going into Cuba through tourism and stuff like that. It became a major industry for Cubans, tourism during the Obama era. But yeah, you're correct. Sanctions continue under Obama.
Monisha, would you tell us a little bit through the psychological lens, what do Cubans have to live through? What is it really like, life under the blockade, both metaphysically and psychologically?
Well, I mean, obviously, I can't speak for them really about what the trauma of that is like. I visited 3 times through the end to end of the country, and had the opportunity to talk with anyone who would talk with me. And I think I can only imagine really how hard day-to-day life is, and especially with so my focus is really on psychological warfare, on the use of it and the targeting of people's with it, right? So I can't imagine
Sure.
how challenging it is to live in the circumstances of constantly being targeted and having your mind sort of like attacked, right? So one of the things that when Jovanni was talking about Obama making room and thawing relations, I also think that was part of opening the door for more intense, focused psyops. So internet, cell phones, doing more business, showing the juxtaposition of here you are suffering, and just really, really allowing that manipulation to take root in a different way. And I think that that's part of what led up to now, what we're seeing happen now, because of course, the generations that follow those who were directly involved in the revolution and got to see and who lived under Batista and who understood the difference and had some perspective on, U.S. interventionism in their country. And now you have a different set of generations that aren't as close to that and are maybe easier to manipulate and easier to draw into what the U.S. wants them to see happening. I talked to one person. She's an Afro-Cuban woman who lives in Guantanamo, and she was telling me on one of my visits that a lot of the perception outside of Cuba also is that just because the revolution happened, everything got better, and that people are surprised when they come and they see that not everyone's condition has improved in the same way at the same rate. And people have this misconception that socialism and revolution are like this, when it's really a process. And she talked a lot about how, the treatment of women was being addressed and the treatment of Afro-Cubans was being addressed, and what some of the challenges that they were facing with that at the same time that they're being sanctioned. So having to build a nation, right, from scratch, really, and address all of the contradictions that are within your nation as the people living there in the day-to-day, doing it from the community up, while at the same time all of this psychological warfare is coming at you. It's no wonder that people continue to flee, and it's no wonder that there has been some success on the part of the United States to intervene through the San Isidro movement and to be able to manipulate things and attempt a soft coup and try to undermine the revolution and the people. Because you can only take so much. And just like the quote that was put, I think, I can't see it now in the chat, but the one that described literally in the US's own words, its intentions with the blockade. And you couple that with psychological warfare, which is the basis of all of the other tactics of hybrid warfare. And thank you, to bring about hunger, desperation, and the overthrow of the government. So you add the psychological warfare tactics at the same time that people are hungry and desperate. And there you go. There's your foundation for flipping the table, flipping the cards, and taking control person by person. And it's violence. Like, that's one of the things that I don't know that people outside, people in the first world really understand, is the violence of that psychological manipulation, turning families against other families, turning family members against family members, destroying, the relationship that a country has with other countries in its vicinity. All of that has a trickle effect. So there's also the loneliness of Cuba. Imagine, that part, and trying to be in government and be in leadership and take care of your people at the same time that you're in these unimaginable circumstances. I can't, I've tried to put myself in the shoes of Diaz-Canel and other leaders in Cuban government during the pandemic, during increased sanctions and imperialist aggression, while your people are dying. And how do you make decisions? What do you do? So these are the types of things that I wish other people would also think about before they open their mouth with a criticism of life in Cuba. None of us have the right to do that, really. And we don't have the right to criticize the Cuban government for anything. The only people that have that right are Cubans living there. and they can't even really do that without the intervention of the United States, manipulating even their own perceptions of their own lived reality. It's really sick. I'll stop there.
I would imagine that it's very hard to know who to trust. That it's a constant wondering about it, and not so much maybe people that are very close to you, but just in terms of, is this another line from, American interventionism, or is it accurate? How do you determine, um, what's actually happening around you or in the world beyond Cuba because of the nature of U.S. control? Um, can you guys bring in the Cuban exile community a little bit? Tell me, I'd like to know. Um, I'd like to understand things from their point of view, and also just that um, as you just said, they're not Cubans. I mean, they're not indigenous. They're not living in Cuba, deciding what needs to happen for their country in that moment. Um, but also, they have a very powerful voice, especially here in America.
Yeah, I can definitely take that one. But before I get into that, I really I think it's really, really important to talk about how the world has voted over 29 times to end the blockade, right? In the so Cuba is definitely not alone. Like there is solidarity all across the world, and people that understand the cruelty, and who also are sanctioned, because a third of the world is sanctioned by the United States, right? And so they understand the cruelty of the unilateral coercive measures that the U.S. puts on people, just so that people can so other countries can play ball the way that the U.S. wants them to. And so the Cuba has had every single play in U.S. imperialist playbook, right? They know their enemy better than anybody else. They have bridged the two Cold Wars, right? And their people have too. And there is need. There is a lot of need. But I don't know. I just wanted to say that. And with the Cuban American exiles, they're a very interesting bunch. I grew up in Miami, and and I grew up like with all of that counter revolutionary talk. Like nobody cares about Cuba more than Miami people do, right? Like Univision is always talking about Cuba on television. Like you don't get that anywhere else in the US, right? Until something big happens like this. Essentially, the Cuban American population is weaponized by the U.S. to carry out whatever deeds they want them to. Meaning, like, they are given this power, like Narco Rubio and the mayor of Miami calling for international terrorism, essentially airstrikes, when really they're municipal government leaders. Like who does that? So they've been given this insane amount of power, but it's more power that the U.S. government wants them to have in order for their goal of ending socialism in Cuba, putting Cuba under their thumb again, and making it their playground like it used to be. I think like my family, they're I love them, but we are not politically aligned. When I went to Cuba in 2019, my mom was in tears because it's just like we've told you so much like about this country. Why don't you believe us? And it's like, it's not that I don't believe you, but I want to see it. I want to talk to people. You haven't been there in 40 years. It's changed, and you are for the blockade, which hurts. It hurts the people. It doesn't. They think it just hurts the government of the island, but it hurts the people the most. And it doesn't matter. You can tell them till you're blue in the face, and you won't break through. But when I went to Cuba, it was just beautiful, because it's like, they said welcome home. And the other way, if like Cubans come to Miami or to the US, like that, they're shunned upon by their own people, because they have been acclimated in the United States to assimilationist thinking, right? That white supremacist capitalist thinking, where it's very individualist, like we've been in the U.S. for so long, like we're better now than the people back home, than our own family members, and it's a really gross way of looking at your own people. And it's like Monisha was saying, like it's a violence where families, a country is split based on ideology, and it shouldn't be like that. And I think if people were to go to Cuba and see it and live it, talk to people, see how it's safer than the United States. They have they have things that we have been demanding for decades, and they're blockaded. So it's just like, they have healthcare. They have an insanely great education system, and they're internationalists. They've been providing and they've been helping others, like with the liberation struggles, and educational with the Yo Si Puedo literacy campaign all around different countries in Africa and Venezuela, Bolivia, and then sending their heroic doctors all over the Henry Reed Brigade, right? And so, the Cuban exiles will poo-poo everything that Cuba has done to liberate itself and liberate others, and essentially they're a weird fascisty kind of phenomenon. I mean, even the Proud Boys are backing them, and yeah. Jovanni, you want to say more about that? Oh, you're muted.
It's very weird, and it's like there's a movement in Latin America. The Cold War hasn't ended. You think it's tough being left wing here in the United States or whatnot. I mean, think about being left wing or socialist in Latin America, where there is a history of you disappearing and being found in a landfill, or like the like the Argentines used to do, where they'll pick up socialists or in a helicopter ride. They take them to a ride, and that ride meant that they'll take them to the ocean, drop them in the ocean, right? So that's how deep hatred towards socialism by right wings, by the upper crust of societies in Latin America runs. You have this society, you have these people, these comprador people that feel they have more in common with Americans and with Europeans than they do with their own people. They live in these silos places in Latin America, the silos, of wealth, where you go to the cities, to these parts of the city where there's people living in literally favelas around them, and they live in this gated community, and you can swear you're in Miami somewhere, with the nice big houses and everything like that, right? So these people, right, it runs really deep, the hatred, right? So these people are the ally. So there's this symbiotic relationship between the Miami right-wing Cubans with the right wings in Venezuela and Nicaragua and in Argentina and in Chile, et cetera, right? And there is this relationship, and they collaborate with each other. Matter of fact, there was this. I don't know if you heard of Operation Condor, where this Operation Condor was the CIA-led initiative where they collaborated with the government, with the intelligence agencies of the right-wing governments in Latin America, right? Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, Paraguay, etc. Right? Operation Cut. So all these government working together, right? And the sole purpose was to hunt down leftists. That was their purpose, to hunt down socialists and leftists, right? So the collaborators. So that's how deep it runs. That's how deep the Cold War runs in Latin America, right? And I mean, in Puerto Rico, they've been very influential because it wasn't only Miami where these wealthy white Cubans left after the fall of the Batista government, right? They also went to other places, and they went to Mexico, they went to Puerto Rico, they went to other places, right? In Puerto Rico, particularly, right, a lot of the people that worked in television in Cuba before the before the triumph of the revolution, they ended up working in television in Puerto Rico. So so they brought their politics with them, and they were influencing. So in Puerto Rico, you have a situation. Puerto Rico is a colony of the United States, right? Right now, living during this debt crisis, Puerto Rico have lost about 200,000 of its citizens in residents in the last 10 years because of this debt crisis. Of Maria, the debt crisis. Puerto Rico right now is under a junta, under financial junta. They call it what do they call it? Podemos, right, which is something that was enacted by Obama, which is like a junta board of like 9 people that make all the economic decisions in Puerto Rico, right? And of the 9 people, none of them are Puerto Ricans. They all come from here. I think one of them has one Puerto Rican representative, but everybody else is from the financial sector here in the United States, from the bank industry and stuff like that. They make all the financial decisions in Puerto Rico, right? So Puerto Rico right now is living under a kind of sanction regime, but it's an extreme austerity regime. Schools are shutting down, everything's being privatized. People are leaving, people going into bankruptcy, or people getting laid off and stuff like that. So that's the democracy and freedom that the Miami Cubans want for Cuba. You know what I'm saying? So when I say democracy and freedom, that's what they want for Cuba, right? If you look at El Salvador, not El Salvador, yeah, El Salvador. If you look at these caravans of hundreds of thousands of people, right, marching from Central America, trying to get into the United States, right, mostly coming from right-wing government countries, right, mostly coming from countries that are democratic and capitalist and free, and these people are leaving in caravans, right, going from Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, right, trying to make their way to the United States, right, on foot. And these people are coming from these democratic, freedom, capitalist countries that these people in Miami want Cuba to be. So all these contradictions, right? These contradictions. I mean, you heard what's his name? When Ilhan Omar confronted him in Congress, Abram Adam, was it Abram?
Yeah, Abram.
What was his first name?
Elliot
Abrams, right? When she confronted him, he oversaw the dirty wars in El Salvador, and when she confronted him about them, right? What was his answer? Well, we brought democracy and freedom to El Salvador. Is that democracy and freedom that they want in Cuba? You got to ask yourself that, right? Cuba is under, and none of these countries are sanctioned, by the way. El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, whose people are fleeing on foot to come to the United States. None of them are blockade. None of them are sanctions. So you gotta see the contradiction here, right? Cuba, under extreme sanctions, have been able to provide to its people. Cuban government is a government of action, right? What does that mean? A government of action is a government that is active in trying to provide basic needs, the most basic needs towards people. I mean, if you heard the other day, President Joe Biden says that the communism is a failed ideology and Cuba is a failed state. Now, what is the definition of a failed state? A failed state is a state that cannot provide for its people. A failed state is a state that cannot provide its basic necessity of his people, right? That's a failed state. I mean, you can call Somalia a failed state. You can call Yemen a failed state because at the time they were in times of war, so the government does not have control of things in the country, right? So there's a lot of there's warlords and all this and yada yada yada, right? Cuba is not a failed state because despite being under crippling, cruel, sadistic sanctions, right, it's able to provide for its people. Cuba, in Latin America, if you were a child, the best place to be a child in Latin America is in Cuba. In Cuba, you don't see children going through landfills looking for stuff to sell, trinkets to sell in the market, like you see in Guatemala, for example. You don't see that in Cuba, right? Cuba eradicated homelessness, right? Under the Cuban Constitution, right? It is the right of the people, or the obligation of the government to provide roof, ceiling over the head of its people. You don't have that in the United States. You go through California. You see Tent City and what do you call it? And I forgot what I call it. And Slick Road or Silk Road, right? You see canopies. You see a whole bunch of tents of homeless people, right? Because in the United States, you don't have a right to a home. In the United States, you don't have a right to an education. Right? In the United States, you don't have a right to medicine. You don't have a right to clean water. I mean, look at the people in Michigan, in Flint, Michigan, right? They're drinking that poisonous water. You don't have a right to clean water. You see what I'm saying? So if you're going to go on the definition of a failed state, Cuba is far from being a failed state. Cuba can provide for its people. They don't have much, but whatever they have, they ration it, to ensure people do not go hungry. You don't have that here in the United States. You have 1 out of 5 children are food insecure. You have food deserts in the United States. You know what I'm saying? So the government of the United States does not provide for its people. So if you're going to call a country, if you're going to call it a failed state, you got to call the United States a failed state because it cannot provide to the majority, to all of its citizens. It cannot. It has a citizenry that is considered a surplus. You say it's considered a surplus. You have a quarter, kind of like you have I think 3 million of your citizens behind bars, in jails and in prison, the discarded people, So you have a society that discards people. Whereas in Cuba, that's not happen. You don't see homelessness in Puerto Rico. You don't see malnutrition kids. You don't see hunger in Cuba. You still have the basic needs, despite the sanctions.
Yeah, if you ever need a good example of how the United States feels about impoverished people, you just have to look at its own. You don't have to. That is the state that they want the world in, essentially, to be able to excavate money from their lives in one way or another, and to just not care about their livelihood outside of a dollar amount. You have the freedom to file for medical bankruptcy. They're not actual freedoms, but they want us to pretend that they are, that there's some actual there's something actual worth there. And we talk about our freedoms, but like you said, if you don't have the freedom to have a roof over your head, if you don't have the freedom to receive government assistance without guilt from the community, if there's assistance to be had, what freedom do you really have? So what else, guys? What else can we dig into here about Cuba?
I want to hit on one point before I forget.
Okay.
I want to talk about identity politics, and because usually what we get a lot, especially in like spaces where we're trying to understand, is like we need representation, right? And we need somebody from that country to tell us how things are, And so I think that what we're seeing today, like with what's happening in Cuba and how like Miami Cubans are reacting, we can see how identity politics is problematic because Biden put out today in like a new what is it, a White House speaker fact sheet about measures on Cuba, that he's going to listen to Cuban American leaders. Like, who are our Cuban American leaders, right? We have the crazy that's calling for airstrikes against a whole population that's done absolutely nothing to him. And then Narco Rubio, and Jose Menendez from New York, like all these political heads, our Cuban American leaders are not the leaders of Cuba, right? And so we need to, listen to the leaders of Cuba. Listen, like the sovereignty of the nation, the self-determination of the nation. Like we you should know that if the president is kind of working with you, there must be something wrong because that usually never happens, right? And I think we just have to think about that when we see these very manufactured destabilization movements that are happening more and more frequently.
Yeah, there's something fundamentally missing, I think, from most Americans' discussion trying to look at other places in the world, and that is that Americans, we don't really believe in any genuine form of collectivism. We have our house, we have our family that we want to talk about, and there's, excuse my French, there's kind of a fuck you zone outside of that. And I go back. It immediately goes back to something that Bernie Sanders said a while ago. Is that I want to help people I've never met. I want to help. I don't need to meet them to understand them. To know that people need food, people need a roof over their head, people need medical care. They need to have the ability to provide for themselves, and we're not willing to say that, in America, much less the rest of the world, are people actually able to do that? What does survival really look like for people that are on limited income? What does survival really look like for being Cuban living under a blockade, where some of the simplest things that the rest of the world has are scarce, if entirely non-existent?
Yeah, ideology is very important.
But like you said,
Speaking of that, sorry.
Oh, who gets to decide that Juan Guaido represents Venezuelan? It certainly wasn't the Venezuelan people, much less if we were to pretend that Donald Trump won our election in the United States. But those are the kind of choices that the U.S. gets to make. And most everybody, they're just like, well, why isn't it? It's just easier to fall in line, isn't it? Well, no, it isn't, because people want more, and they should be able to go after it without risking their safety and without having to have their family split apart along sectarian lines. Go ahead.
Thanks. Are you able to show one of the two graphics that I sent you? There's one that has less arrows, and that's probably the first one that I want to show. And I want to show this in relationship to what Rachel was talking about with identity politics and ideology, and especially because of the U.S. left is kind of plagued by social imperialism, and really the the identity politics as they have been usurped by neoliberalism and fascism, capitalism, and all of that really helps manipulate people inside the states to support the U.S.'s war narrative. And thank you. So in this diagram, and I got this from a paper that was actually done by a major. This was at an army school in Kansas. This was part of a paper on the U.S.'s failure to properly use information warfare in Iraq. So in this diagram, you can see in that big arrow that says war narrative, and you have the smaller arrows inside. That's the operational narrative, strategic narrative, and political narrative. And then from there, you can see where those arrows go are the target audiences. And you have the political narrative that goes to internal audiences, and those internal audiences then support the policy that drives the war narrative. And so when we bring and thanks, and you could show the other one next if you're able to. So the way that the U.S. sort of uses the identity politics as a weapon to promote its interventionism and everything is it's part of celebrity culture too. So you've got like Celia Cruz, a bunch of different celebrities that are propped up as the representative voice. Gloria Estefan. I remember as a kid watching her on the news talk about the dictator Fidel and, her forlorn look off into the distance from her balcony in Miami, or on her boat talking about how she misses home. So when
I'm sorry. But can I add something to about Gloria Estefan?
Sure.
All right. So I don't know if you guys knew, but Gloria Estefan, right? Her dad was part of the Bay of Pigs expedition. Her dad was captured in the Bay of Pigs expedition, and he was traded as a war prisoner, and was traded in when they made the exchange. Right. Her dad also was a military person or an official in the Batista government. So that's where Gloria Estefan gets her politics from. Go ahead.
Thank you. I didn't know that. That makes a lot of sense, actually. And so it's like using people like her and using people whose ideological stance matches what the United States' ideological stance is, and propping them up through weaponized identity politics is part of how the U.S. left is manipulated into supporting imperialism, into just falling in line with the narrative and holding up a banner and screaming Patria y Vida and SOS Cuba, and instead of like putting the thinking cap on and questioning, as the left should be questioning these narratives, particularly when well, I don't know. I have my opinions about the first world left in general, but it really is rooted in social imperialism, which is just, if social conditions can improve for the United States, then they don't have to care about colonialism or imperialism and can continue justifying the invasion of other nations to further their own comfort. So yeah, I just wanted to add to that. And I see the question of from Jake. Can y'all perhaps address why you think these endless attempts at regime change has failed repeatedly? Do y'all view it as a function of Cuban revolutionary strength or U.S. ineptitude? Personally, I think both. I think that the U.S. severely underestimates the strength of the Cuban people and the love that is there for the revolution because it's theirs. It's their revolution. And you can't take that away from them, no matter how hard you try. And the U.S. has shown that it just needs to stop.
I'm sure the added generations between the beginning of the blockade and now, and that understanding where Cuba's place sits in the picture of the larger world as far as U.S. hegemony is concerned, that this is the best we have right here, and we're not going to let go of it. That just in the same way that kids here are taught that the military is awesome. Although the military is not awesome, Cubans are actually awesome. They actually have that was actually something that Jake talked about earlier, that in his own experience being in Iraq, that understanding that the war fought in Iraq was not, from the U.S. side, was certainly not fought for the freedom of the Iraqi people, but that the struggle of Cubans in Cuba is actually for their own liberation and their own choice to have the kind of government they want and to not live under a sanction that literally murders them.
Henry, can you show some of the tweets that were going around on July 11th? That's when the whole protest kicked off. And it's interesting because when the protest kicked off in July 11, right? I was on my way to Houston to watch a baseball game, the Astro versus in Miami, not Miami, New York Yankees. And I'm always on top of what's happening in Latin America, Cuba, Venezuela, and everything like that. But anyway, we have my sister-in-law is visiting, and we were in the car on our way to Houston, and I guess she was looking through her social media, and she asked, "Hey, what's happening in Cuba?" I said, "I don't know what's happening in Cuba." What's happening in Cuba? Something's happening in Cuba. I mean, it was blasting. The social media was just blasting. That was July 11. My daughter told me the same thing. Yeah, I saw it on social media. I saw it on TikTok. There was a whole bunch of messaging on Cuba and stuff like that. That's pit bull right there. And what was happening is that's when they were doing the attempt on the trying to do this color style revolution inside Cuba with these protests that happened right outside. Started outside of Havana, and according to the media, if American media, it spread from there. But it was there were people just like President Canel Diaz, right, said, there are contradictions in the revolution. There are people, having, issues, and he said, and there were authentic people out there protesting, real material issues. But there were also opportunists there. There were also opportunists there that were trying to drive a different agenda, and their agenda was to overthrow the government, right? They were to overthrow the revolution, right? They were counter-revolutionaries. They got mixed into that, and they were trying to hijack the vulnerability. They were trying to hijack the desperation of people, to drive it towards a different direction, right? And one of the things that happened was that Diaz-Canel went straight to the people, to the place of origin, which was a place called San Antonio de los Baños, which is right outside Cuba, right outside Havana, and talked to the protesters, right? And it's interesting because I have friends in Cuba, and they were messaging. There was messaging from Cuba as well, because one of the things that Diaz-Canel said to the people, right, is that we have to, those who want to defend the revolution, come on, defend the revolution, and we need to fight the enemy in its own terrain. What we mean by that is the way the American media was spinning it was that Canel was calling for slaughter in the streets, right? But when he meant by fighting the enemy on on their own terrain what it meant by social media, because this was a Bay of Pig by media, by social media. You know, it wasn't a physical Bay of Pig, but it was a social media Bay of Pig. I think there's an article that says that Bay of Pig, a virtual Bay of Pig, something like that. Which they did this storm of social media and trying to incite people into revolting. And going back to what Monisha was saying about the strength of the revolution, it didn't happen. It didn't happen. They were sadly mistaken. They were sadly disappointed, because one of my friends in Cuba, when I asked him, you know, how are things over there, he told me that the Bay of Pig invasion, that's an example of a bot right there. And I'll tell you a story about that bot. Some of the bots, you know, if you notice, they're saying this, they're repeating the same message over and over again. What they were doing there, it was a deluge of messaging on Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, all the platforms were, Facebook, all the platforms were pretty much saying the same thing, and they were enlisting celebrities like Snoop Dogg saying SOS Cuba, you know, Camila, what's her name? Camila, the one that says sings Havana Ooh La La. She also came out as well. Daddy Yankee also, you know, SOS Cuba, and you know, this was in the Maryland. That was in the Maryland Stadium. You know, Patria en Vida. That was the slogan that they were using and everything. So this was very coordinated. An attempt. This is a very coordinated attack. You know, what they call the virtual Bay of Pig. And one of the things that my friend when Cuba was telling me is that when the first Bay of Pig landed, we defeated them in 3 days. This Bay of Pig, we defeated them in 3 hours. You know, because the people came out. In support of the revolution. And then if you looked at mainstream media, if you look at Fox News and everything like that, and MSNBC and CNN, and they got caught doing it. They were showing protests in Miami, saying that it was in Cuba. The protests in Miami against the government in Cuba was larger than the protests in Cuba. You know, so they were showing protests in Miami, you know, that was and said it was in Cuba. They even showed a protest in Egypt. You know, they showed a protest in Egypt, you know, saying that it was in Cuba, and they had a whole bunch of Egyptian flags, you know, in the back, right? They even showed a pro-revolution protest, and they had the 26th of July flag there, and it was massive people, and they said it was in Cuba. You know, and the way, if you looked at how these corporate media were talking about, they were talking as if any moment now Havana was going to fall. Any moment Havana's going to fall. It didn't happen. I mean, people bust in. People were coming from all over. You know, people just came out to defend the revolution. You know, because these are people that want to live with dignity. And one of the things that Danny says, right? And I heard from Danny a long time ago. Danny Surgeon said that one of the things about policymakers and Americans in general believe, and going back to the question that somebody asked here, you know, if it's American ineptitude and whatnot, is that most Americans believe, right wing, you know, conservatives and liberals and everything like that, they believe that inside every individual in the world, right, there's an American ready to pop out. You know, that's something I heard Danny says, right? You know, and that's one of the miscalculation that American policymakers have, right? Because they assume that. I think they generally believe that inside of every individual is an American ready to pop out. He just got to be liberated, you know, and boom, you become an American, right? And what happened in Cuba, you know, this attempt was defeated soundly because people came out in mass to defend the revolution. And once again, it showed the miscalculation of these planners. People were planning this and everything like that. One thing about the Mariel boat lift, right, in 1980, when about 100,000 Cubans left in rafts and were picked up and taken to Miami, right? Before that, there was a kind of uprising. That's one of the things that the mainstream media, the corporate media, kept referring to. There hasn't been something like this since 1994. But the Mariel was in 1980. The Mariel, right? One of the things that Fidel went out and spoke to the people and told the people, right? The reason they call it Mariel boat lift is, you know, those who wants to leave, right? Those who wants to leave can leave. through the Mario dock or the Mario port. Those who wants to leave can leave to the Mario port. But those who wants to stay there and defend this revolution, right, welcome to stay. Only 100,000 people left. Everybody else stayed. A country of 11 million. That tells you something. That tells you something about the strength of the revolution in Cuba, and that is the threat. That is the threat that Cuba poses to these American policymakers. These leaders, policymakers, is this example. This example as that a country so small with a population of 1 million people cannot be broken. Cannot be broken, right? And that right there, right, is a threat. It's not a military threat because Cuba cannot invade the United States. It's not an economic threat, but it's a moral threat. It's a moral threat that's what makes it dangerous.
Yeah, I think there's like a quote that says like, when people stand up for the liberation, imperialists tremble, and it's true. Like I think that's why, like, I mean, the U.S. couldn't do anything with Vietnam because they don't, like Monisha said, underestimated its people and the love for its people. It underestimates indigenous people in its own country, in the U.S. Like the power of being indigenous, like that. It's in your being. That you can't buy that. You can't sell it. Like it is something that capitalists and the U.S. imperialists can't have and will never understand because they don't understand what that feels like, right? And so we see it, I think, in almost every place that we've fought or tried to start wars. And yeah.
I'm interested in your take on Cuba. What have you understanding of Cuba? From whichever point you started paying attention on Cuba until now. I'm turning the table around. I'm interviewing you now.
One thing I wanted to mention before I forget, and then I'll answer your question, that and you guys have certainly touched on it, but the fact that these protests have gotten such coverage in the media as opposed to the massive protests that have been going on in other places. You actually, I remember now, Jovanni, you're talking about the caravans, people coming north from Honduras and such. But that the media just swings. If the U.S. says point your cameras in this way, they will. But if they ignore it, then they ignore it. It has to actually get shoved into our media space here, and the media space is entirely run by people who support and believe in U.S. hegemony. So my impressions of it, I kind of see the struggle in a similar way as I see the people in Iraq struggling to create their own country, their own space, absent U.S. policy, absent U.S. forces. Still hasn't happened. That it's uplifting to see that there are small but very determined places where people are willing to fight U.S. hegemony, even if it means that that even if it means drawing more of the U.S. ire in doing so. Is we all deserve we all deserve to have our rights respected. We deserve to be able to feed our kids. We deserve to be able to put a roof over the head and get them to a doctor. And I think that's part of it, is that the U.S. is so backwards in that way that our country is always extracting from its people in one way or another. And to see another country not do that, to not believe that the lifeblood of keeping it going is to take and take and take and give nothing in return. Yeah, the power of that must be immense. And but it horrifies me. You know, I don't think that people should be seeing any difference between hungry Cuban children in Cuba and hungry American children in America. But we do. You know, they're both political props, but they're not actually people. They're not actually human beings that need to eat, that need to be cared for. Again, it's just one more resource that we can attempt to extract something from. I hope I answered your question somewhere in there.
Yeah, and also I want to add to what you're saying. I mean, and I mean it's incredible the feats and I mean under these harsh conditions, like I mentioned before, right? This small island nation, this small island nation, right, is not driven by extraction, like you said, not extraction from its people. It's driven by caring for its people, right? So here in the United States, they call the Cuban government a dictatorship, right? So I mean, the case can be made that it's a dictatorship, but it's a dictatorship of the people, you know. Whereas we live here under the dictatorship of the market. You know, the market rules, the market controls. You know, the market decides if you're valued. You know, Oprah is valued at I don't know how many millions people, how many $1 million, but Joe Smith, you know, doesn't have a dime. Doesn't have a dime in his name. You know, so he's not valued. You know, so those are the contradictions that before. Here, people here in the United States point fingers of others, right? We need to really deep down reflect in what you called your democracy. I keep hearing people say, like when Trump was in power, we're losing our democracy. Our democracy is on threat. At what point are we going to say that we lost it? How far does it have to be? How far does it have to get? Before we say we've lost it. Because it seems to be going downhill. It seems to be going. I mean, right now. What is it? More young people, more millennials, right? Doesn't really see optimism in their future. They're riddled with debt. They live with their parents. They don't see a way out. Whereas the ideology of socialism is optimism, right? Revolutionary optimism, right? It's making things better. It's progression. It's creating a vaccine. That cure lung cancer. Is creating a vaccine that ends the transmission between mother and child with HIV. It's sending soldiers. It's sending soldiers, Cuban soldiers, to Angola. To defend the revolutionary government there, and the media, right, to help the media in its independence from South Africa, right, and by doing so, ending apartheid in South Africa by doing so. One of the things that Africans will talk about when they saw Cuban soldiers in Africa in the 80s, fighting, they defeated the South Africans twice. One of the things that Africans will say is we're astonished by seeing black Cuban officers, right, commanding units of white Cubans. They've never seen that before. It's always been the other way around. So that right there was a huge motivator. That was a huge, morale booster for the Africans, right, to free themselves from European colonialism and from South African apartheid. Because soon after that, apartheid fell. After the Cuban expedition in Africa. So that's revolution optimism, right? That is progress. That is being progressive. I'll end right there.
No, I when I hear about Cuban doctors going abroad to help treat COVID or to deal with other crises, I go back to where I was in my mind before I joined the military, that I envisioned that America did that. That it was actually exporting a unmitigatable good to the world in one way or another. And Cuba actually does that. Despite everything else that the Cuban people have to carry, are weighed down by, they still promote that idea to the rest of the world. And the rest, and like you guys said earlier, talking about how the UN voted on it, only the United States and Israel were the lone dissenters in those. So it's obvious that the strain and the complicity of the international community is shifting a little bit. Whether it will shift enough that the U.S. might back off some, I couldn't, I don't know what that answer might be. Um, but it is hopeful to know that other countries, even some countries that are very connected with U.S. foreign policy, have said this blockade is too much. This is too. We have gone beyond the pale here. Um, but yeah, who knows who knows when or if that'll ever actually change. Well, if you guys are good with it, I think that's a good place to wrap up. Monisha, did you want to talk about your webinar coming up this weekend? And I'll throw the invite up here on the screen.
Thanks. Actually, before I do that, could we? I know Rachel had wanted to mention some caravans that are happening. Could we start with her?
Sure. Yeah.
Yes. Thanks.
Cool. Thank you, Monisha. So yeah, I want to say that basically our task here in the U.S. is to fight against like the imperialism, right? And so we need to push our own government to do these things. And this weekend, Carlos Lasso from Fuentes de Amor, who started all the caravans in support of ending the genocidal blockade on Cuba, is going to arrive in Washington, D.C. And so there's going to be, he basically had him and maybe 5 or 6 other people, supporters with him, walked from Miami to Washington, D.C., and they're arriving on the 25th. And so there's going to be solidarity caravans like across the U.S. And if you look on answercoalition.org, you'll find a bunch of different cities. Definitely check it out. In San Antonio, we're going to have one calling for the end of the blockade and against U.S. intervention in Haiti. And so definitely show support wherever you can. And thank you so much.
So, yeah, I'm in Puerto Rico. I'm via Kensei, and we have our tiny island was used by the U.S. For war games and weapons testing, same as Culebra, the little island next to us, above us, and we're struggling. We actually are living in the conditions that people are shaming about Cuba. And it's because of our colonial status. It's because of how the Puerto Rican government models its policies and attitudes after the United States. So this Saturday, and I apologize, I'm so tired from working on this, organizing this thing. It's huge. We're reaching out again to the international community. So when Culebra kicked out the U.S. Navy, and then Vieques eventually kicked out the U.S. Navy, the world was with us, and we need the world to be with us again. So that's what this is, and it's this Saturday from 12 to 2. Please go to the caravans if that's what you were planning on doing. because this will be, the English translation will be on YouTube, on the U.S. Peace Council's YouTube channel. So you'll be able to watch it later. If you can join, if you're not able to get to a caravan in support of Cuba, then you can join by Zoom. There's some, on that announcement, there's some, the registration link for Zoom. Translation's available on Zoom. And if you can't get it off of this ad, you can go on Twitter to @US Peace Council, and there are tweets about it. And you can get the registration information there. So it's organized by the U.S. Peace Council and supported by Black Alliance for Peace, as well as the World Peace Council. And Puerto Rico is even though we are like the Colombia and Israel of the Caribbean, many of us are with you in Cuba. Many of us have shown our love and solidarity for Cuba, even though our unelected leaders have offered their support for U.S. regime change. So I'll just say that. Oh, and I would like to ask that, especially folks in the veteran anti-war movement and veteran anti-imperialist movement, I know it can be hard. I know my first visit to Cuba, it was really challenging because my worldview was being shaken at its core. Everything that we're taught inside the United States about Cuba, we have to confront that. Like, we have to wrestle with it. We need to cancel the word nuance. There is no room for nuance, first world nuance, in conversations about Cuba. Just do what you can to stop the blockade. Whatever is happening inside of Cuba will be dealt with by Cubans, and it will be easier to deal with without the blockade. So your only focus needs to be on ending the blockade. Stop worrying about critiquing the Cuban government. It's not your place. And let's really get a grip on the social imperialism, please. That's my hope. Thanks.
Jovanni, any alibis, man?
I think everything was said here. I think both Monisha, Rachel, and yourself, I think y'all laid it out beautifully. You know, don't be a social imperialist. You know, yeah. I mean, it's just like Monisha said earlier. I mean, these manipulation artists, you know, they were trying to manipulate, you know, emotions in the ground there, but also trying to manipulate emotions here. This is Black Cuban academic. Her name is she penned an article on Truth Out. Her name is help me out, Rachel.
Is it Cuco Frusco?
What is it?
Is it Cuco Frusco?
No, the other one is Cisnero.
I didn't get it.
Odette Cisnero. She's a Black Cuban. She teaches like Black studies, and I think she's in Pennsylvania University, something like that. Anyway, she penned an article on Truth Out, which a Truth Out is like a progressive leftist media, right? So she penned an article there. It's called "Cuba's in My Heart," something like that, right? And she used all the tropes that are used in American left circles, right? She used Black Lives Matter. She used LGBTQ. She used police brutality. She used the militarization of police. She used human rights abuse. You know, she used LGBTQ. I said that already. You know, talking about, you know, police brutality and all that. All the tropes that are used here in by American leftists, right? She used it in that particular article, right? Her intentions are well known there. Her intention is to manipulate the emotions of American progressives and left circles. You know, that's what she was doing. You know, also keep in mind that although the protests, some circles, some media say there was the protests in July 11th were like hundreds, and some say there were thousands, right, of people protesting and stuff like that. Keep in mind that last summer, right, last summer here in the United States, it was registered that about 15 million people went out to protest George Floyd and Black Lives Matter. 15 million people at one time, protested throughout the city. So the protest here last summer was overwhelmingly larger than the protest this past Sunday, July 11th in Cuba. So if a protest of a few hundreds or a few thousands, right, equals regime change, then what does a protest of 15 million people here means? Just think about that.
No, but that's the duopoly that we have to live with. That we see people fighting for their lives, be it in the United States or elsewhere, and their voices are marginalized and ignored, if at all possible. And you have people that are on the side of regime change, on America's side in that way, and they're asking for bomb strikes onto Cuba. I don't know if they've ever seen an airstrike on a place, any place at all, and seen what it does to people. But how is that an answer? How is that a it was like you guys were saying about that the Cuban people have their own right to self-determination. Everybody has the right to not be bombed because the country bombing you doesn't agree with your government. That's not an answer. That's not a solution. It helps no one except weapons manufacturers and whatever politician can tie it to for their own political ends. So, well, I think that's a really great place for us to wrap it up today. I want to thank all three of you for being here. I know I've learned a lot. I'm sure everybody on the stream has as well. I've got a mental and internet stack of the books I'm going to start reading on Cuba, just to understand this in a more wholesome way. And I have to, it's like you, Monisha, you said earlier that the crap, what was it? And never mind, I lost my train of thought. But people deserve to feel safe, to be safe, and to not have to worry about other countries deciding what's going to happen there, especially when it's a country like the United States who has no interest in the lives of ordinary people anywhere in the world, especially its own. So, all right. Thank you, everyone, for joining the stream, and we'll see you again next time. Take care.
Bye. End the blockade.